Welcome to Building Resilience, a podcast by Hatch for insights around risk management for sound business practices. I'm Joelle Peng.
And I'm Martzayan.
Your hosts for today's episode.
Today we have Jason Jarrett with us. Jason is a resilience specialist in our risk management group at Hatch. Jason has over 30 years of experience in helping clients establishing emergency preparedness and response planning, business continuity, crisis management, and disaster recovery. And he's currently working on probabilistic resilience modeling to help clients be better prepared to manage unwanted events. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. Hi, guys.
Hi, Jason. Welcome. To start us off, we recently read your blog post that was published last year on hatch.com about the resilient storage of tailings. Can you tell us about how you would define building resilient organizations?
So taking the same concepts as you would to a facility, to an organization. It's a very interesting subject, isn't it? You could talk about what is the bending moment of an organization. What is the point where it goes from elastic, what did they say, plastic to elastic failure? I think really a characteristic of resilience is the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The more readily you can adapt to those changing circumstances, the more resilient you are. So typically in an organization, the need and the mode for that is communication. So the more effective communication you have within the organization, the more resilient you are, the more you can adapt to the changing circumstances. So it's notable that organizations that have very strict hierarchies, very strict kind of rules and regulations that keep them within tight confines are the very organizations that are very vulnerable to sudden unwanted events because they can't adapt, they can't deal with events outside of the norm, as it were. But an organization like Hatch, where things are changing all the time, from one level to another level on different projects, different people, there's always an element of change and communication, therefore, taking place. So its ability to be able to adapt to what's going on makes it inherently resilient. It's where you have those fixed policies or fixed approaches that don't give people those what I would call semi-loose type properties that enable them to kind of overcome the challenges, because there's so much uncertainty to deal with. Even in the best organized world, there are so many channels for uncertainty, you can't possibly control them all. Therefore, you need to be able to have kind of bounds that give people the ability to manage that uncertainty and the tools to kind of reduce it so we can make better, more informed decisions. Does that help?
Yes, that helps. But I guess my question is, so then how do we better assess risks?
How do we better assess risks? Well, I think to start off with, we need to better define what is the outcome that we want for any particular activity, and being able to define what is success, what is the desired outcome, and what is it that you're prepared to accept as less than if it comes under threat. So we need to understand, for example, are you prepared to lose your entire reputation over this project? In which case, that changes how you measure risk, what's important to you. Are you prepared to lose your operator's license? Are you prepared to? So I think once you understand what is the particular pain points that the organization is willing to accept, then you can understand what are the risks that should be measured, because which ones will lead to those particular pain points. They're not always going to be engineering. Engineering doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in a community. It exists in a context. Something that happens in a particular place doesn't necessarily, just because it happened on a particular location doesn't mean to say it's not perceived to have happened everywhere by nearby communities and everybody else. And as you know, people act on perceptions. They don't act on what's actually happened, because often we don't know what's actually happened for several days. However, the better you are at communicating, the more transparent you are, the quicker people will understand it's not an issue. And that requires building trust and openness. And I think that's possibly some of the most exciting things that we can now start to see in aspects of community work in remote areas in Canada too. I think some of the ways that these projects are now being managed and looked at and even started or thought of or spoken of is starting to kind of develop the kind of trust that can lead to those long-term relationships. And it's those long-term relationships, if we go back to the subject of tailings, where we're looking at trying to keep a facility relevant or safe for 50 years until it can be relinquished, 50 years or more, then being able to have a sustainable community of people who understand what's there and are managing that transition of issue is absolutely essential. For example, 50 years is perhaps 4 people's careers. It's not just one person that you're handing it on to. So how does it change? Does the nature of the risk change? Do our tools change? And have our technologies changed where we can reduce that relinquishment cycle?
Very interesting. This reminds me of an article I read on the First Nations approach to dealing with risks. Is whenever they want to make a decision, they look back 7 generations and decide whether the decision impacts 7 generations ahead. And if it does, they make their decisions accordingly.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, I've heard the same. Yes. And I'm still learning about it. I'm still learning what does decolonization of engineering mean and understand. It's a huge subject, and I feel like as a new Canadian, I feel like I'm only just scratching on the surface of my understanding here.
Definitely. We'll have to revisit this conversation with one of our experts from our community engagement team.
So you mentioned the importance of communicating effectively to be able to build that trust. So how would you do this practically within an organization?
Is it adapting to sudden change? Is that what we're talking about? Adapting to sudden unwanted change, or are we adapting to long gradual change? Because if we are not capable of identifying long gradual change, so let's say, for example, climate change. Climate change is really very, very interesting because we know it's going to happen. We know it is happening. And we know because of the work that we're doing, we're needing to plan for this and to forecast for this. So now we need to engage with climate scientists, to be able to say, what is this climate going to look like and what kind of changes can be anticipated over the next 60 years? So we're now in a very different world where we're trying to forecast climate risks. So what does that mean for the supply chain? What does that mean for where will people live in that area? What will that mean for water levels? What will that mean for the level of any docks involved? What will that mean for the fireproofing of infrastructure? What will that mean for a range of different activities that may not be exposed to now, and may be hard to justify to investors now, but will be visible in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time? That's a whole different dynamic. So these are because it happens hour by hour, day by day. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts because you don't see how it's become a reality.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the things I think now that we know it's happening, and because some of the mitigation strategies are going to require, for example, building or re-strengthening or changing a bridge or moving a conveyor, or being able to do things that are perhaps 10-year projects.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps we spend 2 years getting the money together, engage on a 10-year project to build that piece of infrastructure, by which time it will be ready for the climate change that's perhaps anticipated. So some of these mitigations have long lead times and require really bold courage, to be honest. Yeah, but if you don't do them, the science is getting better and more accurate all the time. So yeah, so I think that's a really hard thing, for example, to communicate to an organization that is always bases its work experience on what happened yesterday or what's happened so far, not necessarily what could happen, especially in well-regulated environments like engineering, where there are processes, it's methodical, we have a science for this and this. So for as long as we base everything on this and this, we're going to go in a particular direction and we're going to get a particular outcome. But everything's changing all the time. Everything from the technology we're using, the technology others are using, living in an integrated society. And yet, with all the change that's happening politically as well, and talks of deglobalization and changing demographics, we have to be capable of adapting for lots and lots of reasons.
So speaking of adaptation and ever-changing landscapes, Can you tell us about building resilience into mining activities, like specifically tailings? Why is that important?
Well, I think building resilience into tailings is really important, and some of the reasons I've touched on, earlier, because legacy tailings are huge. The quantity of tailings involved is getting ever bigger, and it will get ever bigger using our current technologies at the moment, because of our need to switch to a green technology world. So we're going to produce more tailings because we need more of these metals. So these tailings that go into these dams, and yet there are lots of different technologies for trying to manage them and to make them safer, and we're getting better and better at it all the time. But we already have the last 200 years worth of development in tailings that have not benefited from the same technology and the same effort and the same investment as would be required now by regulation if you were going into the future. So there are a number of different activities. One is to establish what we currently have and how do we stabilize what we have and understand where people are going to live and what can be done on that basis in terms of stabilizing what we have. Then secondly is about enabling what could be and being able to build in ideas, for example, the way that we manage tailings facilities and gathering data. What certain data points will give us very good indicators of how well that particular facility is performing. Is it getting stronger? Are the tailings more stabilized? Is the water content X? What has been the seismic movement for the last 2 years? So we're taking what has been the average rainfall for this period of time. So all of that information over a period of time, we can now start to learn from in order to be able to adjust the strategy as we're going. So we're actively managing that closure plan. So these things make the organization resilient to these facilities failing and hurting people. But like I said, it's really important is what is the values? What is it that you're defending? It's nearly always safety comes first, but then there are issues where the environment is another angle, and these things have to be paid for. I mean, one aspect of legacy sites is that people forget is that when a mining company buys another mining company, that mining company already has assets, and they bought that from another mining company that has assets, and these all go back, eventually hundreds of years, to the point of what is it that this particular company is responsible for? Therefore, who manages what's left? And normally that's in the public estates.
So to end off this podcast, we've been seeing geopolitical tensions intensify. How can organizations build resilience given the risk of sanctions?
Again, this is building business resilience in terms of being able to stay in business and be able to protect shareholders. And if that's the outcome, then that outcome would be to, I would say, would be to align with what the policy will be that will be led by the West, inevitably, because that's where the largest economy is and that's where our bread is buttered. So I think the question of being able to show compliance with sanctions, not infringing on those sanctions, understanding export controls, understanding what constitutes advice or expertise that's being given, being very clear about that with our clients, understanding our exposure to, we may be having a conversation with a client who may be a proxy for somebody else. So, for example, how is that information going to get to somebody that wants it? How can we control our expertise to make sure that we fall in line with the policy of the West? I'm not speaking on behalf of any company. That would just be my personal view, looking at the economics involved and the people who've got the power.
Fantastic. This is very enlightening. Thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you all for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like, comment, and share. For more information about building resilience together, visit hatch.com.